Welcome to In a Nutshell, the podcast dedicated to all things agricultural consulting. I'm Dylan Brush here with soil genius and ag consultant Bill Brush, and we're delighted to accompany you on this journey where we break down the different aspects of agricultural consulting. In each episode, we'll dive into the realm of agriculture through the eyes of Bill Brush, where consultants like Bill play a vital role in empowering farmers, agribusiness, and agricultural organizations. If you're passionate about agriculture, problem solving, and enjoy a little bit of detective work, this podcast is tailor-made for you.
Well, welcome back. This is Bill Brush, another podcast of In a Nutshell. Today we're going to talk in a second of a series of podcasts that I'm putting on sample fertility programs for different crops. And our first one we did was almonds. And now we're going to talk a little bit about walnuts. And in the future, it'll be some more tree crops that we'll look at down the road and some field crops and try to get you a general guidelines, at least something to wrap your head around and get started with a good fertility program. So today, talking about walnuts, we're going to talk about English walnuts. That's what we grow here in California, and most of the walnuts grown in the U.S. are English walnuts, and those varieties are like Chandler's, Howard's, Tulare, Hartley's, and several others. I don't want to diminish anything, but they have been grown successfully here for quite a few years.
Now Bill's going to explain some of the differences between almonds and walnuts and some of the characteristics of walnut trees.
The first thing you want to notice the difference between walnuts and almonds is that walnuts they need a lot less nitrogen. And this was kind of surprising to me because anybody that's been around a really beautiful walnut orchard understands the density of the canopy that they put on and the amount of shade that they put on. It's a full canopy, really, really dense, dark green leaves when they're really healthy. And I was always under the impression that took a lot of nitrogen, even more so than almonds. What you're going to find not only in any nut crop or anything that's making a seed is the nitrogen is needed for the reproductive part. That's where it really has to load up. And the leaf surface is secondary. Leaf surface does need, the more density of foliage and the more leaf surface you have, and the terminal leaf on a walnut can be as big as your palm. It can be a huge leaf. So they have huge leaves on these things for a lot of photosynthesis, but they don't put on, in terms of numbers, the number of nuts that you would in an almond tree or pistachio. So when we're looking at that, we find out that they need less nitrogen. So it only goes back to say it has to be related that it needs more nitrogen for that spark to get cell division going at a very high rate on those nut crops like almonds and pistachios. So we use less nitrogen. And we talked earlier, it can be 250 to 300 pounds of nitrogen in an almond crop, whereas with walnuts, you only need on very, very mature, high-producing walnuts somewhere between 150 and 175 pounds of nitrogen. And you can see it's quite a bit less, even though, you have a monster tree with this huge amount of foliage.
That's really interesting, Bill. You wouldn't expect to need less nitrogen on a plant that produces much larger leaves and foliage. Very interesting. Now Bill's going to talk about some of the other nutrients that walnut trees may need less of than you might expect.
Also needs a little less K, and so we only have 120 to 150 pounds of K as total K is needed, and a little less phosphorus, only about 15 pounds of phosphorus, and remarkably about the same amount of sulfur. You need about 100 pounds of sulfate sulfur for your growing season. So when you come in here, you'll see when you start talking about both in the frequency of nitrogen application and also on the timing that it's quite a bit different. When you go into post-harvest, 35 pounds of nitrogen is really enough. So that ends up being 150 or so pounds of ammonium sulfate and somewhere around 10 gallons of UN32 will make both of those work really well. Okay. And because they are later emerging, we don't really look at anything in the wintertime. We're clear into March before we really begin to look at putting more on. And you might bump that. And one of the things, if you happen to not get your post-harvest nitrogen on, and this is in any crop, be expected to start earlier and more often early on to try to do some catching up. You won't do as well as if you'd got the post-harvest on, but you'd have to put it on a little bit earlier to try to catch up and get it in and get it up to that growing area. Remember that walnuts could be as much as 45 to 50 days to get it from ground, taken in the roots all the way up to that growing tip because it's a lot larger tree. Okay, so we look at around sometime in March. They're not as predictable. A walnut tree is not as predictable as an almond tree. So I say around March, most of the time it could be mid-March, could be late March before we really start to see anything. They really respond negatively to cold weather, meaning if it starts to get cold in late February and March, it'll hold back bud break very much so. And so with that in mind, you just have to, you can't quite refine it quite as tight as you can on almonds, but they're a lot more forgiving in the uptake because walnuts have, a time where they'll flower and put and set nuts. And then there'll be another time, maybe a week or 10 days, they'll flower again if they can, and they will put on more nuts. And there could even be a third time that they flower and set. So there's almost like 3 different types of walnuts that have been set on there. And that is really important for trying to get them sized all to the same good size nut. If we try to just feed them all and that's the way we do it, we don't take into the consideration the early ones and the late ones to try to get them all set at the same size.
Now Bill's going to recap a little bit on the nitrogen.
So we look at putting out nitrogen after that, sometime there in March, following it up with sometime in April and sometime in May and then sometime in June. And if you say, like on almonds, we're going to start harvesting those in August. We won't start harvesting a lot of these till, late September or early October. And so because of that, that's why you're allowed to, it allows you to, feed later into that. So you're looking at putting about somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 gallons of UN32 or, 150 pounds of ammonium sulfate for the first 2 applications. And then we're down to 30 pounds of nitrogen and then 25 pounds and just, slowing down as we make these applications as we go through there. And they're a really good feeder. They're a sturdy tree, and their foliage growth is more uniform. If you want to look at it, it's like an almond tree is a racehorse. It starts really, really fast, and then it's finished. But a walnut tree is more slow growing, slow to fill. It takes a lot longer, so you have to be not as precise, but you have to make sure that that nutrient is available over a long period of time. And it's the same thing with potassium. We like to spread it out with more applications for potassium throughout the year. Well, walnuts do quite well with just a winter application. And if you don't make that an early spring application, you could go out into February or March. And then come in about May and get your second application in and put about half of what you're going to put down. And so that's somewhere around 200 to 250 pounds. SOP is probably your best bet during the season like that. And phosphate, using a little less than almonds, but in phosphate, we're looking at if you're a little short, that early liquid will really work well, much like it did in the almonds. But you can wait clear into late February, early March to get that on. And then if you prefer dry, well, you can use a product like 1152O and put you out 150 to 200 pounds. It's a really good shot of phosphate early in the season. And then hopefully you'll get enough uptake of that to spur the roots out to seek and find more phosphate that's in your soil. A lot of times the phosphate is there, but the roots have to grow into it. And that's what makes it so much different than nitrogen or potassium or micronutrients or sulfur, calcium, magnesium. All these nutrients flow to the roots in the soil solution. But with phosphate, the roots have to grow into it. So a lot of times this early little kick of phosphate that you put on before things really get going. It gets into that and it basically makes those roots expand because it acidulates out some phosphate out that's tied up out there, and all of a sudden it'll just continue to spur root growth out there. And that early flush of roots is really helpful because you can get that into the plant early. That'll take you all the way through to harvest.
Now Bill's going to talk about the role that micronutrients play in growing walnuts.
The one thing that's different, I put a number on all the micronutrients that we like to get up to. But in walnuts, there is two particularly: boron, which really helps in pollination, and as it does in almonds also. And it's really helpful to be putting some on earlier. If you're a guy that puts on, you could put on blends. If you happen to put in some other dry on, you could mix your boron in there. I tend to like to put on my micros together because it's usually a smaller volume and they don't separate quite as much as they do in a big volume of fertilizer. So, but just putting a little bit in there to get your boron up. One of the things about boron, though, and it's the true, a little's good and a lot is terrible. It is very, very toxic, and it really causes a lot of phytotoxicity to walnuts because, particularly if you don't have enough calcium, it will take all the starches and sugars in your leaves close to the end of the year, and it'll push it all into the nut, and it'll take everything out of them, and they'll defoliate and look horrendous. But a lot of times it'll come back out the next year. So be very careful. If you're running 1.5 parts per million in your soil, that would probably be where I would stop. Yeah, you can go up to 2, provided you have plenty of calcium. And when I say plenty of calcium, you want 65 to 70% base saturation of your calcium. If you have that, you can push it to 2. There's really no advantage to go any higher. So if you're at 1.5 to 2 is kind of the primary, that's like the excellent range. Just get in that area and it'll stay there. It doesn't leach very rapidly, but it will leach over time because it's not really tied to the soil colloid. It's kind of a neutral element. So
now Bill's going to get into talking about manganese.
But the next one I'm going to talk about really is one of the true keys to great walnut production, and that's manganese. Manganese with a G, not magnesium, manganese. And a lot of people confuse the two, and they say, well, they tell me I got too much manganese. No, you've got too much magnesium. They sound close together, and if somebody like me that just makes their living out of soils, I don't make that mistake, but it's easy to know when you're not just living and breathing this every day where that's an easy mistake to make. But this key to manganese, it does a lot of things. It basically is essential to an enzyme to make lignin in the plant. Very, very important. Give it limb strength for all of this heavy crop you're going to put on and all that leaf mass. But the true magic to manganese is how it's able to set more doubles and more triples and even into your quads by being able to make that more fruitful at the fruiting site. An almond, every one of those blooms is an almond. I know that there's an almond in that could also be 2, and we can make a double, but it's in the same shell. A walnut truly is a fruiting site where you can put 1, 2, 3, or 4 walnuts and even more sometimes. But what you're trying to do is make that more fruitful. And not only that, it increases set. And that's the key to any nut crop, is having enough manganese to make sure that not only did you bloom and get them pollinated, but you set that nut. And by setting the nut, now you have a chance to carry it to the end where you can, get, paid for that, all the work and all the effort to get it up to that point and then have it fall off the tree. Walnuts are, if you follow them through the years, you'll see a lot of them be on the tree. But if you go out there on that fruiting site, there'll be 1 or 2 or 3. And if you'll go back and mark them and go back, you go back and all of a sudden you'll see, oh, I don't have 3 anymore. I only have 2. And you'll see kind of a little scar, which heals over. And in a week to 10 days, you don't even know it was there. And so you just look at it, well, I only got singles here and there. Probably had a double there, maybe even a triple. But because of the lack of nutrition, primarily a lot of it being manganese. Because you don't have enough there, you're going to you find that it's not setting, not holding on to them, and so therefore your crop, it's really easy math. If I have two and I would have had three, I have 33% more crop. So that's big in a hurry. If I had one and now I have two, I just doubled the size crop that I was going to have. And so those are the things that can really add up and really pay for themselves. Is manganese cheap? No, it's not. Not at all. And if you want to build it and you're really short in your soil, and again, without a soil test, we're just guessing. A lot of people say, well, I heard him say manganese is good, and we'll throw it on there. That might not be what you need. You might need something else. It might be a zinc, or it might be potassium, or it might be phosphate. You can't just tell because I'm concentrating so much on manganese. But if you look on your soil test and it says your manganese is low, and whatever soil test you're using, if it says you're low and to add some, you need to add a lot. And when I say a lot, most manganese sulfate, and that's the dry product that you need to use. It's really difficult and almost prohibitive expense-wise to try to build your micronutrients with liquids. They're just not concentrated enough. It's like your potassium, the most potassium I know in a liquid is KTS, and it's at 25%. And there's probably some others that might be slightly more, but 25%. But I can get to a 50% with SOP. That sulfate of potash is 50% K. That's what you're really wanting, is that K. Well, the same thing happens when you get to manganese. You see a lot of solutions that are 5%, 10%. Okay, well, manganese sulfate's 30%. But if you want to build up manganese rapidly, it's very difficult, very expensive. But a couple 100 pounds of manganese sulfate could cost you $120 to $30 an acre to put on. And if you're real low, you might have to do that for 3 or 4 years in a row before you'll really see the result from that. But if you don't start early, you're never going to get there because you're never going to have the crops you need when they come in. People I've done this with have had really tremendous success of getting good crops by building up that manganese. And I'm talking building it way up. Excellent level is 100, but you really need to be 150 to 100 and anywhere up to 200. Some of the best orchards I see, they were just blessed with, they had the manganese in their soil to begin with. And they happened to plant, walnuts in there. And they had tremendous crops year in, year out. They did a good job with their nitrogen and irrigation. And so they did all the things right. But that manganese was a freebie that they got. Myself, I started with one that was extremely low with almost no manganese. It was down, if my number that I'm looking to put on my soil test at 150, I was starting at 20. And I was building it up at about 30 parts per million per year. And I did that about 5 years. And so that got me then up to about 150 to 175. And I was always getting good crops in between those two. So I'm getting the benefit of it, but I'm also building manganese over those years. And now today I don't need near the amount I probably might put 50 pounds of manganese sulfate every 3 years or so. And that's all I need because it doesn't use a lot. Just having that high number makes it very available to the plant and gets it into the plant so that it can retain a lot more nuts. If you're behind, much like almonds, if you're behind and don't have a lot, then it's foliar again. And there's some good foliars. It's kind of funny. There's a fungicide for blight that's used a lot, Manex, and it's been in the system and then out of the system for a while. But when it was in there, one of the things it had was manganese in it. And that extra manganese, I think, gave you a little bit of kick on set because it was in that foliar spray early in the season. The problem you have with walnuts is there's not a lot of opportunities. You've got a blight spray, and then by then you're not doing a lot until you get out to worms, mites, etc. down the road. By then, set's way, way over. So this is why I'm kind of harping on manganese soil applied to get that number up. And anytime you can get a foliar app of manganese into that system, you're going to be beneficial for you. It's really good. Also, with these big, broad leaves that you'll see in walnuts, the other thing that's really helpful is zinc. And a lot of people put the zinc on, but don't put the manganese on. And zinc's a great distributor of nutrients. It basically spreads it throughout all that leaf tissue and the nuts, and so it's also very with that big of a leaf surface. It's so helpful to have higher zinc numbers that balance out with your phosphates, so that you can get nutrients across over those barriers.
Now Bill's going to talk again about soil tests.
Again, I've talked about soil tests, and I probably run it into the ground. It's the basis for what you're going to run a fertility program on. If not, you're just guessing. So you start with a good educated guess, and multiple years of soil tests takes the guesswork out almost altogether. And then you can see what you're building, see what needs to be built, prioritize it, and then put it into your total budget. I'm going to tell you manganese, where on almonds I wasn't, as important as I'm putting it on walnuts. So there are crop differences, where one is super essential, one is essential, but in the case of walnuts, this manganese is super essential.
Now Bill's going to explain why having a proper irrigation schedule is crucial to walnuts.
And then it gets back to having done all of these things and put it in place, is get your irrigation schedule right. And a lot of problem with walnuts is they pull a lot of water early and then kind of balance out, because most of that ground's under shady conditions the rest of the year. I've got some orchards that it almost never sees the sunlight, and until we started vertical hedging a few years ago, a lot of these never saw any sunlight once the canopy filled in. So they will stay wet for a lot longer, a lot of humidity in there for that water to be held under that canopy where it's going to be available to those plants. And those plants are transpiring like crazy with those big leaves. So they're pulling up a lot of water, but they're sending out a lot of water too. And so it's just a good system that works very well. The other thing is that late in the year is really managing water for nut quality, meaning there's lots and lots of more mold showing up on walnuts. So irrigating properly as you get near the end and not getting them too wet. This again is that big advantage that a irrigation system has over a flood irrigation, because with a flood irrigation system, one day you have no water, the next day it's flooded, it's underwater. And that's going to stay a lot longer, and it's under these trees that stay shaded for a long time. And so it takes a long time to dry it out. If you get any kind of grass or wet, moist conditions and you're knocking, those nuts are starting to fall, the windfalls come down and they start to build up on the bottom before you shake and rake and pick up. Those have a really good opportunity, if you got moist conditions, to basically start a mold in there, and that really knocks your grade down. So all of those things have to do with proper irrigation all through the growing season. It's amazing that those big trees with all that leaf surface will use a lot of water, and if we don't supply it, it'll come back to the hull and the nut, and that's where we get a lot of tip shrivel, etc. Is that we just don't supply enough water for those super, super hot days in July and August when we're getting near the end. And so, again, these tree crops are indifferent to what you want. It's already made the nut. That nut's a reproductive body. If that nut would fall and get buried under the ground, there's enough germplasm in there to basically germinate and grow a walnut tree, and that's all that walnut tree cares about. So if it shrivels a little bit on the tip, doesn't really care. We do, because we're going to get dinged for it in grades, or we're going to lose it in weight. Either way, they're not very successful for your returns at the end of the year. So for today, that's kind of a quick, down and dirty fertility program for walnuts. And this is just a program if conditions were a certain way. But it gives you kind of a direction on where to go and what actually to put on over the years. So until next time, keep farming and keep listening.
Thank you for another absolutely fantastic episode of Agriculture in a Nutshell, Bill. I'm sure everyone listening absolutely loved to hear what you had to say about what it takes to grow walnut trees and their fertility program. Make sure everyone leaves a like, comment, and subscribe, and always stay curious.